Dr. Lang Fafa Dampha is no doubt a man who has displayed an exceptional intellectual ability towards contributing to the development of Africa. An author, researcher, and social scientist, he has, through his dedication to African integration and reconstruction, contributed sagaciously to the development of the continent through his writings. Dr. Dampha has written both novels and academic books to demonstrate aspects of African exploitation through the slave trade and colonialism, and expresses the African identity and personality for African reconstruction, development in the perspective of Africanity and the total liberation of Africa in this era of post-colonialism that, for him, is as detrimental, if not more, as slavery and colonialism.
Pan-Africanism is based on the idea that the peoples of African descent have common interests and should be unified. Historically, Pan-Africanism has often taken the shape of a political or cultural movement. My interest about Pan-Africanism is based on this basic concept of having common interests, having common challenges, and coming together to try to surmount these challenges. If you look at the history of the world, it is only the African continent and the Africa south of the Sahara that has been colonized, that has been reduced to slavery of all its forms, that has been colonized, and that is still suffering from neo-colonialism and imperialism in the larger context. So the African people should come together to surmount these challenges, these difficulties in Africa.
Dr. Lang Fafa Dampha was born in the Gambia. He had worked as community development assistant in the Gambia from 1985 to 1989. After his successful training at the Rural Development Institute in the Gambia, he then migrated to France with a General Certificate of Education, GCE, ordinary level, and a National Certificate in Integrated Rural Development. He lived and worked in France as an immigrant until 2009. Dr. Dampha obtained Bachelor of Arts degree in English Language, Literature and Civilisation at the University of Paris 7 Jussieu, and a Doctor of Philosophy in English Studies, Society and Culture at the University of Paris 4 Sorbonne. Dr. Dampha taught legal English, law and politics UK-USA at the University of Paris 2 Panthéon Assas, and economic English, Introduction to Banking and Finance, the Stock Market, and the History of Economic Thought at the University of Paris 8 St. Denis for 2.5 years. He returned to Africa in November 2009 to more directly contribute to African reconstruction and development. Well before his return to Africa, he had been at the forefront of the struggle for African reconstruction and development. Since his early years in Paris, having observed the French and larger Western attitude to Africa and Africans, Dr. Dampha decided to further his education as a means of self-emancipation and equipping himself to better contribute to African reconstruction and development.
I struggle on the African Renaissance, and this African Renaissance is the renewal of our approaches, the renewal of our conceptions, the renewal of our perceptions of our own selves and the world at large to be what we are.
To fulfill this mission, he had guarded in his mind to go back to Africa. After his return, he assumed duty in November 2009 as Senior Research and Program Officer at the African Academy of Languages, ACALAN, which is African Union's specialized institution in Bamako, Mali, mandated to develop and promote African languages as a factor of African integration and development. He was subsequently appointed acting executive secretary of the Academy in August 2015 and then confirmed as executive secretary in January 2019. Dr. Dampha also served as interim director of the African Center for the Study and Research on Migration from March 2021 to October 2022, which is also a specialized agency of the African Union mandated to enhance understanding of Africa's migration, improve the overall migration governance regime in Africa, advance the knowledge base of the African continent on migration and mobility issues, and contribute to evidence-based interventions on migration in Africa. Since he became the executive secretary of ACALAN, he has built upon the foundation laid by his predecessors by systematically bringing African languages to the discourse on development and demonstrating how important Africa's languages are for the integration and development of the African continent. Dr. Dampha has demonstrated over time that he is a thorough researcher and has brought this quality to bear in his current position at ACALAN by identifying problems and reviewing related information to develop and evaluate options and implement solutions. ACALAN has made giant strides in recent years, and unsurprisingly, Dr. Dampha has been central to this development. He has led by example, bringing his expertise and experience to the fore and charting the course for the Academy. It is indeed a landmark achievement for ACALAN under the leadership of Dr. Dampha. As an author and wordsmith who has passion for writing and has carved a niche for himself in that regard, having written many books to contribute to the struggle for African integration and development. Among his collection of books are Sub-Saharan Africa, Memory, History and Reparation, the United Nations Organization and African Reparation, Reparation for Slavery and Colonialism, Teachings of Durban, Sub-Saharan Africa and the Bretton Woods Institutions, Peculiar, a novel, Traumata, a novel which is a sequel of Peculiar, African Migrants, novel, West African Nationalism and Reconstruction, Truth, Justice, Reparation and Reconciliation, Lessons from Cape Town.
Both academic and story books, novels, and writing is a passion for me, but it's also a responsibility on me to extend, to relate my ideas about African development, about African reconstruction, about African reparation. The idea of reparation for me means that Africa has been destroyed as a continent. Africans have been destroyed as people. African cultures, African values and norms have been tampered with, and we need to regain, and this is the basis of the African Renaissance. My writing is based on this: reconstruction and development, reparation, and we need to tell the story, the history of the slave trade, the history of slavery, the history of colonialism, the history of imperialism in Africa. We are living in the era of post-colonialism, but what is the situation right now comparing to what had happened? What is the situation? What had been the situation in other countries, in other continents, in other nations, amongst other peoples? So this is a responsibility for all Africans to contribute to the Renaissance struggle of the African people.
Dr. Langfafa's writings majorly focus on how African continent can totally regain its freedom from the effects of slavery and colonialism. As an author of many books in Africa that has voiced out mostly in his publications against racism, racial discrimination, slave trade, colonialism, xenophobia, and related intolerance on the African continent, Dr. Dampha is undoubtedly a great independence fighter, linguist, researcher, genius leader who has contributed to the development of Africa through his remarkable writings and the Academy of Languages, ACALAN, the African Union's specialized institution mandated to develop and promote African languages. one of his words about reparation for Africa. The indispensable factors of African reparation in the larger context of socio-economic development are self-discipline, self-respect, respect of African values, rigor, professionalism, and genuine adherence to African socio-cultural values.
An African is an African wherever he or she may go. And I think the main responsibility for an African today is to delve in, to get into this African reconstruction struggle, African renaissance, African reparation, and globally, finally, generally, African development. Now, African reparation for me, which is very dear to me, requires Africans in the process to work according to their cultural values, and especially the transformative aspects of these values. The individual African should be part of the collective African. The individual African should be part of the collective Africa. That is the gist of our development.
For the banco, what you want? Woman, Mananu for the Vimbanco. Gambia Molu Ni Dogo Wato Cedar Mobile nyanta togo kelo funna sati sitanya to Fasitanya to Fasitanya to Fasitanya to Fasitanya to Fasitanya to for the Bimbango. Go to more for the Bimbo, Bemo, killing little. Two more men are two babble nata for the Bimbo, Janyanta. Pasitanya tuban, pasitanya tu, pasitanya tuban, pasitanya tu, pasitanya tuban.